आप सभी को पुनः नमस्ते। आज हमारा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सम्मेलन का तृतीय दिवस है और अंतिम दिवस, और हम अभी आरंभ करने जा रहे हैं। उससे पूर्व मैं एक श्लोक कहूँगा। श्लोक ना कहकर इसे चौपाई कहें, क्योंकि श्रीमद जैसे गोस्वामी तुलसीदास जी ने अपने रामचरितमानस में बालकांड में ये चौपाई कही। भावानि शंकरो वंदे श्रद्धा विश्वास रूपिणौ याभ्याम बिना न पश्यन्ति सिद्धाः स्वान्तः स्वस्थिमीश्वरम। जब गोस्वामी तुलसीदास जी जिस काल में हुए, उस समय सिद्धों की परंपरा पहले से चली आ रही थी। तो किस तरह से भक्ति और ज्ञान परंपरा को समन्वित किया है श्री तुलसीदास जी ने, गोस्वामी जी ने अपने रामचरितमानस में, कि जिस तरह से सिद्ध की जो परंपरा है उसमें शक्ति और शिव की बहुत विशेष आवश्यकता है, जरूरत है। आध्यात्मिक उन्नति के लिए उनकी आवश्यकता है, जैसे वो अभ्यास करते हैं, ऐसे ही श्रद्धा और विश्वास के माध्यम से भक्त स्व में ईश्वर को देख लेता है। तो ये बहुत ही अच्छा समन्वय है, जिसमें शाक्त परंपरा, शैव परंपरा और भक्ति मार्ग में हमें समन्वय दिखता है। To start today's session, I would like to invite the chairperson for today's session, the third and final day of this international conference. और आज के जो चेयरपर्सन हैं, जो आज हमारे सेशन का जो चेयर करेंगी, वो है डॉक्टर सहेली। प्लीज ऑक्यूपाई द सीट ऑन द पोडियम। एंड नेक्स्ट I would also like to invite the three paper presenters for today's session, Dr. Dhurjjati Sarma ji, Dr. Antham Homen Singh, and Rupanjali Hajarika. Please occupy the seats on the podium. आप सभी का स्वागत करते हैं, अभिनंदन करते हैं। एक बार जोरदार तालियां हो जाए। इस सत्र का आरंभ करने के पहले मैं कुछ बातें बताना चाहूंगा मैडम के विषय में, जो आज के सत्र के आज के सेशन का जो चेयर कर रही हैं। सहेली चटराज is assistant professor China Studies at the Institute of Dharma Studies, Somaiya Vidyavihar University. She is a fluent speaker of Mandarin, and her research interest includes contemporary India-China relations, politics and state, the society relation in China. Prior to joining Somaiya, she was working as a China consultant for the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. She had been awarded a fellowship by the Ministry of Human Resource Development under the China-India Cultural Exchange Program 2010-11 to undertake advanced studies in China, advanced studies in Chinese. She was also awarded the Taiwan Fellowship by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Taiwan, to conduct research on India and Taiwan. She has been associated with the China Studies Program at Jamia Millia Islamia and the India-China Bilateral Project of the Encyclopedia of India-China Cultural Contacts, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. On several academic assignments, she has traveled to China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. One of her recent translation work include the translation of the book Logging for the Sunshine by Syed Abdul Malik into Chinese under the project for SCO Summit by the Honorable Prime Minister of India, and to be published by Sahitya Academy, November 2022. एक बार जोरदार तालियां हो जाए हमारे आज के सेशन की अध्यक्षिका का। नेक्स्ट हमारे जो 3 पेपर प्रेजेंटर्स हैं, उनका मैं परिचय करा दूं, थोड़ा एकेडमिक रिकॉर्ड्स और उनके जो इंटरेस्ट, जो टॉपिक्स हैं, जो विषय हैं, जो उनकी विशेषताएं हैं, उस विषय पर। हमारे बीच में है पेपर प्रेजेंटर डॉक्टर धृतराज शर्मा जी, धुरजती शर्मा जी, सॉरी, असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ मॉडर्न इंडियन लैंग्वेजेस एंड लिटरेरी रिसर्च स्टडीज, फैकल्टी ऑफ आर्ट्स, गुवाहाटी यूनिवर्सिटी, जालुकाबरी, गुवाहाटी, आसाम, इंडिया। एकेडमिक क्वालिफिकेशन की बात करें, पीएचडी इंग्लिश लिटरेचर्स, द इंग्लिश एंड फॉरेन लैंग्वेजेस यूनिवर्सिटी शिलोंग कैंपस, MPhil Comparative Indian Literatures, University of Delhi, MA in English, University of Delhi, BA in English, University of Delhi. कुछ रिसर्च पेपर है शर्मा जी के, वो जरूर बताना चाहेंगे. बहुत सारे रिसर्च पेपर इन्होंने पब्लिश किए. ओके, थैंक यू. सबसे जो इंटरेस्ट का विषय है, द स्टोरी ऑफ रामा इन द क्रिटिकल इंटेलेक्चुअल इमेजिनेशन ऑफ इंदिरा गोस्वामी. ऐसे बहुत सारे पेपर उन्होंने लिखे हैं. बुक चैप्टर लिखा है. कई जगह उन्होंने नेशनल सेमिनार, इंटरनेशनल सेमिनार में उन्होंने पार्टिसिपेट किया है और ऑर्गेनाइजिंग कमेटी मेंबर रहे हैं. और इंटर स्टडीज यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ऑक्सफोर्ड बिटवीन 11-23 जुलाई 2022 में. तो इस तरह से काफी प्रतिभावान और अच्छे व्यक्ति हमारे बीच में हैं. एक बार जोरदार तालियां. डॉक्टर एंथम होमेन सिंह, एम आई राइट? एंथम होमेन सिंह is assistant professor of comparative Indian literatures in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. He completed his BA English Honours, MA, MPhil and PhD in comparative Indian literatures from University of Delhi. His PhD thesis was on the Ram Katha tradition in the Northeast India. His area of interest are comparative literatures, Indian literatures, Northeast Indian studies, रामायण स्टडीज, टेम्पल कल्चर्स एंड ट्रांसलेशन स्टडीज. तो एक बार जोरदार तालियां हमारे दूसरे पेपर प्रेजेंटर के लिए. थैंक यू. तीसरी हमारी एक विदुषी हैं, प्रतिभावान डॉक्टर रूपांजलि हजारिका जी, जो नॉर्थ ईस्ट से ही बिलोंग करती हैं. उनके विषय में आपको बताना चाहूंगा. तो मोटिवेटेड असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर विद 15+ years of experience specializing in folk folkloric research amongst the tribal community of Assam, India. Strong background in creating insightful research which increased university exposure and help students learning development. Expert in establishing strong relationship with people, increasing class engagement and enjoyment. PhD 2020. Awarded by Guwahati University, Guwahati, Assam, India. This is titled Ram Katha Tradition amongst the Karbis, Devas and Pati Rabas of Assam. And experienced assistant professor, Kamrup College, Nagan, Assam from 2008 to 11. Assistant professor, Shuren Das College, Ajo, Kamrup, Assam 2011 till date. तो एक बार जोरदार तालियां हमारे तीसरे पेपर प्रेजेंटर के लिए. थैंक यू ऑल. अध्यक्षा महोदय की अनुमति से मैं अपने हमारे पेपर प्रेजेंटर्स को बुलाना चाहूंगा. अनुमति है? ओके, थैंक यू. तो सर आप आए. डॉक्टर धुतराज शर्मा जी, दुर्जीत शर्मा जी. थैंक यू.
How do I share my? Yeah, right? Yes. Fine. So, thank you. A very good morning to all of you. It's a matter of extreme pleasure and privilege for me to be here talking about the Ramayana. So my sincere thanks to the KJ Somaiya Institute of Dharma Studies for organizing this seminar and for inviting all of us here and creating a mini India, a mini Bharat. And we are all here talking about Ram Katha. It's such a sheer pleasure doing that. Wish we could do all the way through. So my presentation today is on the retelling the Rama story in Assamese, and I shall be focusing on Madhav Kandali's Satkanda Ramayana. Yeah, so the poet that I'm going to talk about is Madhav Kandali, and the Ramayana that he composed in Assamese is referred to as Satkanda Ramayana, which translates as Ramayana in 7 cantos. And this was composed in the first half of the 14th century under the patronage of Mohamanikya, the Kochare king of Jayantapura. there's a bit of controversy regarding the exact location of the poet because the territorial boundaries of the kingdoms in the 14th century, not very sure. But from the text, whatever evidence could have been able to glean, he refers to the Kosari Raja Mohamanikya. I'll be referring to that. And Banikanda Kakoti refers to the kingdom as Jayantapura, which could be the Jayantiya kingdom. So this is something which is subject to further investigation. Now, Madhav Kandali's Satkanda Ramayana was the earliest translation of Ramkatha, of the Rama story, into a vernacular language of North India. We have the South Indian Ramayanas prior to the 14th century, but as far as the North Indian Ramayanas is concerned, this was the first, in the North Indian languages is concerned, this is the first Ramayana, which was followed subsequently by the Kittivashi Ramayana. Now, the early centuries of the second millennium, roughly from the 13th to the early part of the 15th century, which Sheldon Pollock refers to as the vernacular millennium. But this particular period is, generally considered as the formative years of development of Assamese as a language of Northeast India. Not only Assamese, but this is the period where most of the new Indo-Aryan languages developed as in more or less independent linguistic identities. And this was also a period which witnessed a growing instances of royal patronage being accorded to mostly Brahmin scholars to compose literary works in the vernacular. So we find instances in other languages as well, in addition to Assamese. And amongst these literary works includes the fluorescence of a number of episodic kavyas, the Vardha kavyas, the Yuddha kavyas, based on narratives from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, being commissioned under the patronage of the Kamata king. Kamata was one of the kingdom. I'll just quickly come to a map of Assam, which will make things clear. So this is the map of a slightly later period. I mean, not exactly 14th century, but somewhat around 15th, 16th century. So we all know the present location of Assam, but Assam at that particular point was basically divided into three kingdoms here. Ahom and Koch kingdom. There's also a Kamrup kingdom, which is not shown in the map. This is slightly of a later time. And then we have the Jayantiya kingdom. So then Manipur, Kachari. So maybe somewhere between Jayantiya and Kachari kingdom, we can presume the location of Madhav Kandali, the court of the king Mahamanikya. And possibly it was there where he had composed the Ramayana. Yes, please. एक सेकंड ये मूव होगा कि नहीं? ये तो मूव हो जाएगा. ठीक है. Right. So this is the map of Assam of that period of time, which is Assam Kamrup map. Right. Now, I talked about the various episodic kavyas in Assamese, which were composed, which are based on stories from the Mahabharata as well as from the Ramayana, composed during the 14th, 15th centuries. And these are some of the kavyas which were composed alongside Madhav Kandali's Ramayana. I'm just trying to set the context based on which I will initiate my discussion. This Hem Horosati's Prahlad Story and Horogori Hongbad, Horibor Bipro's Lobakukhor Juddha, Bobru Bahanor Juddha, Tamrodhwajor Juddha, Kobiratna Horosati's Joyodhwaj Bod, Hokuntola Aru Dhurjjati Akhyan, Rudra Kandali's Drona Parva and Satyaki Pravesh. And they all were composed in a period which could be called as a pre-bhakti period. Let us keep this thing in mind. This was the time when the bhakti hadn't yet reached. Bhakti, I'm referring to bhakti as a movement, not as a sensibility. The movement per se hadn't touched Assam at that point of time. Now, the language of these kavyas exhibited the gradual evolution of Assamese as an independent linguistic entity. I already mentioned about it. And the high point of this period was the rendition of the entire Ramayana, the Satkanda Ramayana, into Assamese by Madhav Kandali. So these were his contemporary poets. Now, a significant event in many of the vernacular literary cultures of India around this beginning of the second millennium, which Sheldon Pollock refers to as the vernacular medium, was a recasting of the Sanskrit epics in the language of the people. Now, considering the Ramayana, we must note that these versions in the vernacular were not translations of the Valmiki Ramayana, but were part of a larger and vibrant narrative tradition of Ramakatha in South Asia. Now, A.K. Ramanujan makes a very strong observation, very significant observation regarding the organicity and durability of the Rama story when he says, that I'm quoting him, the cultural area in which the Ramayanas are endemic has a pool of signifiers, like a gene pool, signifiers that include plots, characters, themes, geography, incidents and relationships, oral, written and performance traditions, phrases, proverbs, and even sneers carry allusions to the Rama story, unquote. Almost all of us, on various occasions of our lives, have referred to various characters and incidents from the epics to signify mundane and peculiar situations alike. Now, there are complex and pervasive ways, therefore, in which these epic narratives have left their traces upon both the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of our country. Now, along with myths, legends, anecdotes, riddles, songs, and dances that draw their sources from their epics, we must have also observed the presence of actual places, temples, and even food cultures that carry resonances of their association with specific characters or incidents from the epics. Now, all these factors contribute towards what Professor T.S. Satyanath, is my guru, he calls pluralistic epistemology, quote unquote, pluralistic epistemology, which refers to, I'm quoting him, a model or methodology of understanding a society and its representation systems within a non-confrontational and coexisting mode as compared to a confrontational mode of existence. Unquote. I mean, there is no confrontation between the Likhita and the Maukhika and the Pariveshya. They all merge into a seamless whole. And this is the organicity that A.K. Ramanujan had talked about. Now, the recasting of the Ramayana narrative into Assamese by Madhav Kandali in the 14th century was therefore symptomatic of a suitably developed stage of linguistic competence attained by the Assamese language at that time, so that it could be used to signify and substitute for the classical Sanskrit language of the Valmiki Ramayana. Here I'm talking purely at the level of language. Now then, at the same time, Kandali's accomplishment was also decidedly social-cultural, as it involved not merely a linguistic recasting of the pan-Indian narrative within a very localized tribal peasant community, whether it's Jayantipura or Kachari kingdom ruled by a Kachari king, but its recontextualization within the cultural geography inhabited by the target audience readership. Now, this cross-fertilization between the already developed Sanskrit literary culture and a very strongly surfacing emergent vernacular literary culture during the early centuries of the second millennium was a typical feature of the early medieval period of most Indian languages, including Assamese. Now, this text represents the Assamese response to the internalization and also appropriation of the pan-Indian epic tradition. Therefore, it needs to be analyzed in the light of the normative Sanskrit practice on the one hand, like the Sanskrit practice, the Mahakavyak practice, and the express intention of the author to tell a people's tale in their own language. He says in his text that Doibobani nahi, nuhi, itu lokiko hai kotha. This is not a divine commandment, but only a people's tale on the other. And between these two positions, the text negotiated an interface where the fashioning of an essentialized Assamese idiom took place. Now, this potential of Satkanda Ramayana, I would like to focus on this potential of Satkanda Ramayana to forge a common ground, facilitating the complex interactions of meaning within the nascent Assamese linguistic culture of the 14th century. Now, most of us know about Dept. Dept was the prime Vaishnavite scholar, saint reformer of Assam, And he was the one who initiated Assam into the Bhakti map of India during the 15th and the 16th centuries. Now, Dept, the religious and socio-cultural reformer of Assam across the 15th, 16th century, chose this particular text of Madhav Kandali, which preceded his time by about 150 years, for the purpose of his Neo-Vaishnavite movement, despite the presence of another vernacular version of Ramayana brought out by his disciple Ananta Kandali in the 16th century. So we have basically two Ramayanas, the Ramayana by Madhav Kandali and in the 14th century. And in the 16th century, we have the Ramayana by Ananta Kandali, but there are other Ramayanas as well. There's also there's also Durga Bor's Giti Ramayana. These are textual Ramayanas, plus other oral epics. Now, what happened? Now, during the 15th century, the two books of the epic, namely the Adi Kanda and the Uttara Kanda, were not extant. Now, Madhav Kandali says he had composed the Ramayana in 7 cantos. So it's referred to as Hapta Kanda Ramayana or Hat Kanda Ramayana. But by the time of Shankardeva, about 150 years later, what exactly happens? That we do not find the first and the last canto of the text. The Adi Kanda and the Uttarakanda go missing. So what happened subsequently? Madhav Dev, he is a disciple of Shankardeva, and his guru Shankardev undertook the responsibility of composing the missing books, respectively, at either ends of the epic, and they were completing their work. So what they do, they under the task of composing the text by themselves, and they add their respective compositions to the either ends. Adi Kanda is the first book, Uttarakanda is the last book. The Madhav Dev composes the Adi Kanda, Shankardeva composes the Uttarakanda Ramayana. So basically, that Ramayana ends up having 3 authors. Madhav Kandali is the original author, quote unquote original author, and followed by the 2 editions which come subsequently. Now, as far as the extant books are concerned, so Shankardev and Madhav Dev, they have composed these 2 texts subsequently, but what they have done, as far as the books which are already there, the cantos from Ayodhya to Lanka, what they do, both of them also deemed it fit to insert passages espousing Ekahorana Bhakti. This is, unmediated devotion to one and only Lord within the pre-Vaishnavite narrative structure of the epic poem. So what they do, within the Neo-Vaishnavite movement, this text undergoes certain modifications. So this text essentially belonged to pre-Bhakti period, but when this text was somewhat refashioned by the Vaishnavite gurus, what they do, they insert certain passages espousing Bhakti into the colophons of the passages, right? In this connection, Manjit Barua, he suggests at the possibility of Hatkanda Ramayana as consisting of 2 narratives, the pre-Vaishnavite and the Neo-Vaishnavite, and he remarks, and I quote, that the new dimension that gets incorporated into the text is now the mediating role that the Neo-Vaishnava movement needed to play as an agent of change in the Trans-Brahmaputra Valley. So this text is essentially put to service for the missionary purpose of Neo-Vaishnavism. So the pre-Vaishnavite Hatkanda Ramayana was intended for royal populist consumption. It was meant for Lokik, it was supposedly Lokiko Katha, not a Doibabani. And this provided Madhav Kandali the liberty to experiment with the language and characterization vis-a-vis the source epic. I mean, he refers to the Valmiki epic. Therefore, I'm referring here to the source epic of Valmiki. The Manjit Barua also seems to capture the essential spirit behind the composition of the epic narrative when he states, and I'm quoting him, 2 notable features about Kandali's texts are that it was aimed for a royal clientele, that is the tribal monarchy, and that the text has a social base, which is tribal peasant in nature. This is the pre-Vaishnavite Hatkanda Ramayana. Yes, the Bhakti movement, as I already mentioned, the Bhakti movement was yet to touch the hills and plains of Assam, Kamrupa at that time in the 14th century in the form of an organized mass movement. Now, on the other hand, the Neo-Vaishnavite revision of the text, not merely in the appendage of the 2 books, Adi Kanda and Uttarakanda, at either ends of the earlier extant text, but also in the addition of colophons in the pre-existing books in the style of the Vaishnava poets, served to resituate the text within the larger framework of the Bhakti movement. Now, this necessitated not only modifying the language in conformity with the accepted linguistic proprieties of the day, but also involved in the transformation of the characteristic representation of Rama and Sita from human to divine. Now, what is important about Kandali was the scope of his vision, or rather that of his patron king, that reposed faith in the expressive resources of the Assamese language at that point of time in the 14th century. But the challenge here was twofold. On the one hand, there was the question, the auchatya, the propriety with regard to the representation of Valmiki's epic and upholding its Sanskrit cosmopolitan ethos. I'm borrowing this term from Sheldon Pollock, accrued over centuries of reception across South Asia. And on the other hand, the refashioning of the Sanskrit narrative without diminishing its epic grandeur or a magnanimity, something of that sort exists, rendering it in a comprehensible manner to the classically untutored sensibility of the lay inhabitants of the Kachari kingdom. And the latter exigency also demanded catering to the popular imagination of the tribal peasant community of the region. Therefore, Kandali's use of the vernacular idiom had to do justice to the whole spectrum of objectives that he had set forth to achieve. How much time do I have? Yeah, just give me 5 minutes. Right. Now, the poet's 5 minutes, I'll complete. Right. The poet's intention behind the composition is made evident in the self-declaration of the poet at the conclusion of the Lanka Kanda. He says, Hatokanda Ramayan, Podabandhe Nibandhilu, Lomba Porihori Harudrito, Mohamanik Korbule, Kaiboro Kisudilu, Dugdhok Motilo Jeno Krito. And I'm translating this. I have rendered the 7 cantos of Ramayana in a metered verse form. They were explicating or rather summarizing only the chosen major narratives of the epic. Under the command and patronage of King Mahamanikya, I have only endeavored to provide some poetic flavor on my own in a way that butter or ghee is extracted from the constant churning of milk. At the end of the Kiskindha Kandya, Kandali issues an apologia for his textual interventions, modifications, and rights. Balmiki Rosila Hastro, Goiddo Poiddo Sonde, Tahako Bisaro Ami Korea Probondhe, Aponar Buddhi Orthe, Ji Moto Bujilu, Honkep Korea Tako Podo Birochilu, Kobi Hobo Nibondhoy Loko Bebohare, Koto Nich, Koto Lomba, Koto Onuhare, Doibobani Nuhi to Lokiko He Kotha, Eteke Iharo Dukho, Noloiba Sorbota. This translates as Balmiki composed the Shastra in prose, poetry, and meter. Considering that, I have accordingly composed my own narrative. Whatever I could gather from my own reading and understanding of the text, I have versified the very substance of it. Poets compose in cognizance of the general taste and belief of the people. They accordingly condense or expand the narrative as per necessity. This is not a divine commandment, but only a people's tale. Therefore, never take offense at the rendition presented hereby. And similarly, at the end of the Lanka Kanda, Kandali attempts to stress upon the veracity of the narrative. He says, Pondit Lukor Jebe, Ohontuk Upojoyo, Hajure Bolo Kuddhabat, Pustok Bisari Jebe, Toito, Kotha Napawaha, Teve Hove Nindiba Amako. In case the learned and the scholarly persons do find cause for discontentment with the present translation or the present version of his Ramayana, then I, with folded hand, vouch for having spoken the truth. Then he claims, if you find anything here that is not in the Valmiki text, only then subject me to condemnation, not otherwise. Therefore, under an obligation to confirm as per the textual authority of the Sanskrit Ramayana, and also an inclination to depart from the preordained narrative structure in order to make room for localization, Kandali was fashioning a niche for himself as a mediator between the two functions, and in the process defined the role of the emergent poet writing in the vernacular. And the two instances of self-referentiality quoted above from Satkanda Ramayana testify to the stated endeavor of the poet. Now, I had a few more things to say. This was primarily regarding how the Neo-Vaishnavite influence entered the text and how certain colophons were modified in the interest of the later day poets. But I don't have time for doing that, right? Take 2 minutes. Thank you so much. So now the text of the Satkanda Ramayana, as had already been indicated, which has come down to the present day, is mediated by the Neo-Vaishnavite interventions. I'll read the passage. Now this Ayodhya Kanda ends with Bharata visiting his brother Ram in the forest with a request to return to Ayodhya, and upon the latter's refusal to do so, instead installs his brother's Paduka on the throne. Now the poet's injunction at this particular point, now if you read that, I'm just reading the translation. So this is what the poet says following the conversation between Ram and Bharata, that having known the implication, it is advised that one forsake the company of bad people for that of the pious and faithful. In the companionship of the latter, one ought to listen to Rama's tale with mutual regard and compassion. This is the core truth of all treatises. Know ye all, leaving all aside, all cares. The life is transient, know not when it passes, and therefore no reason to tarry in expectations. In the present Kali Yuga, there is no alternate path to take except that of Madhava. So it so enjoins Madhav Kandali to chant the name of Ram again and again. Now, this is not Madhav Kandali, this is Shankar Dept, who has actually inserted his missionary of this injunction towards devotion into the text. This is this is seen as an interpolation, as a later day interpolation into the 14th century text. But this passage seems to carry a clear missionary purpose, unlike the ones quoted earlier. A similar bent of purpose is evident in the conclusions of other kandas as well, interspersed as they are with Kandali's original claims of purpose. So there's another poem around the same time called narrative poem called Lobakukar Juddha, where he has, we find a similar instance of how retelling is carried out on the part of the poet. Now I'm coming to the last slide. Thus, the Assamese case of vernacularization in the pre-Shankardeva period, the pre-Bhakti period, provided a unique instance of localization that was decidedly secular and fashioned in accordance with the societal base in existence. The Kachari kingdom and the Koch kingdom likewise evolved from an essentially feudal tribal base, and as such retained the spirit of identification of the non-elite cultural composition of the region. In addition, the fact that the ruling dynasties of these kingdoms were not integral part of the Varna Jati order, I mean the Kachari kingdom, or they were part outside the Hindu, they were later inducted, but originally they were not. So in general, could also mean that the patronage extended by them to the poets like Madhav Kandali, Hem Horaswati, and also Hem Horibar Vipro were not necessarily part of the larger pan-Indian framework, the whole Prashasti process, as evident in the case of other kingdoms at work elsewhere. So with that, I come to an end. So thank you so much for your listening, and I look forward to your questions, your comments and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dhurjjati Sharma sir. कुछ समय असम में मुझे अवसर मिला जाने का, और मैं श्रीमंत शंकरदेव विश्वविद्यालय विजिट किया। कुछ समय वहाँ के योग के विद्यार्थियों को मैंने पढ़ाया भी। मैंने एक बात देखी कि जिस तरह से सर ने कहा वर्नाकुलर जो लैंग्वेजेस है, जो आसामीज जो लैंग्वेज है, और वहाँ के जो भक्ति परंपरा जिसमें 15-16 सेंचुरी में शंकर देव जी का काफी बड़ा नाम है और बहुत बड़ी कम्युनिटी उनके साथ है। कुछ स्कॉलर से मुझे बात करने का मौका मिला तो उन्होंने कहा 40 लाख से ज्यादा आसामीज और उस नॉर्थ ईस्ट में उनके फॉलोवर्स हैं, और वो मांसाहार नहीं करते, सात्विक भोजन करते हैं, भक्ति मूवमेंट में हैं और एक साथ मिलके रहते हैं। काफी बड़ा इंस्पायरिंग मेरे लिए था, क्योंकि पहली बार मैं उधर विजिट किया था। थैंक यू सर, जिस तरह से आपने रामायण उनकी कथाओं को पूरे उस क्षेत्र में विस्तारित किया, कुछ ग्रंथों के आपने नाम लिए और हमें एनलाइटन किया। थैंक यू वेरी मच।